The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have the House Democratic leader with us today, David Toscano. Good to see you.
Great to be back, Woody.
Short session, 45 days, but going pretty fast. But talk to us about Charlottesville and the economy there.
Well, the good news is that because we have the University of Virginia, we're always buffeted from the pushes and pulls of the economy, and we always seem to be doing a little bit better than most or all of the state. That doesn't mean we don't have our challenges, but we're doing pretty well economically, and we're seeing some greater uptick in business activity. I think that's a good sign. But of course, Virginia has a huge challenge, and it's called sequestration. A couple of years ago, nobody would have known that word, but now it's on everybody's lips because it's affecting especially the economy of Northern Virginia. We're one and two in terms of DoD procurement and federal grants that are coming to Virginia. And when those dry up, as sequestration is causing, we're seeing a hit. And we're talking about thousands of jobs in Northern Virginia and a lot of impact on our state revenues, which are having a hard time recovering out of the recession.
Now, those are the across-the-board sort of arbitrary cuts, half of which have been borne by the defense establishment.
Right. And of course, Virginia is one of the most dependent states on defense spending and defense contracting spending. It's not just the military, it's also our contractors in Northern Virginia. And when you cut across the board as opposed to making decisions about cuts, that's going to affect the defense industry in a way that really hurts Virginia.
And you mentioned that it impacts state revenues, and it's interesting that those defense contractors, those that still have a relationship with the federal government, may be making less money, so they're paying less taxes.
That's right. When people either lose their job or they're getting paid less for what they were doing before, that's less tax revenue that comes into the state. And of course, people in Southwest Virginia don't often realize this because they've got problems of their own. But Northern Virginia is a huge generator of tax revenues that flow throughout the state, and we neglect them at our peril. I'm in Charlottesville. You're sort of isolated, but we got to think of the whole Commonwealth as we make decisions down here.
So understand, obviously, Tidewater Hampton Roads has been severely impacted, just like Northern Virginia then.
They do too. Of course, their impact is more about the military personnel and the bases that are there. And this governor has been very active in trying to retain the military spending in the Hampton Roads area, and he's been able to help keep various carrier groups here, and that impacts the Hampton Roads area and helps the entire state.
So that just underscores the need to continue to diversify the economy in the Commonwealth.
Absolutely, and this governor has been pretty amazing. Every single day he's out there pushing Virginia, trying to recruit new businesses to the state, trying to use whatever leverage we have to expand businesses that presently exist here, create good jobs that pay good money.
Now, you used the term buffeted earlier in terms of how well your district has fared despite these adverse winds, but the University of Virginia has been buffeted by a lot of adverse publicity that has caused the General Assembly and the public to want some action in terms of what's going on our campuses in terms of sexual assaults. Talk to us about that.
Well, Charlottesville's had a lot of challenges over the last 6 months. We had the whole thing with Hannah Graham and her being abducted and then killed. And then we've had the Rolling Stone article that, as it turns out, it's almost entirely bogus, but raised the level of anxiety and attention to campus sexual assault. So you've got these two pretty dramatic things happening in the Charlottesville area, and we as legislators are trying to respond to them. You know, if you take the campus sexual assault issue, I have a bill, and a number of other members of the General Assembly have a bill that changes the way we report campus sexual assault. Clearly, the old way we've been doing it is not working very well. So we're trying to come up with a new way that gives victims the ability to control some of how things happen with their cases, but at the same time, make sure that the community is not going to be affected by some sort of serial predator who is not charged because somebody is worried about how people are going to perceive them as charging somebody with a rape or a serious assault. We're going to try to find that balance. We're still working on it. I think we're going to get something out that does it a little bit differently, and hopefully that'll improve the whole environment for sexual assault reporting on campuses.
And it's fairly complicated because you've got Title IX with some privacy provisions and reporting requirements. You've got the needs of the victims, as you've indicated. You don't want to necessarily require mandatory reporting on the one hand, but on the other hand, you want to make sure the perpetrator is appropriately penalized with due process.
Some people like to call it enhanced encouragement to report, and that means giving the victims the information that empowers them to do what they need to do, both to help themselves and to help other potential victims in the future. Because if there's a serial predator out there and somebody doesn't report, that puts the entire community at risk, and we can't let that happen.
Talk to us about how important the University of Virginia is in terms of an economic driver.
Tremendously important. You know, you've got in my district, I have, I think, 7,000 people, or my constituents, that work at the University of Virginia. And you have a lot of faculty members who, you know, they don't make as much as maybe they should, but they certainly make a fair bit of money, and they're plowing it into the local economy. All the construction, that encourages the construction trades. So it is a real economic driver, and the university continues to expand, not by leaps and bounds, but every year there are more students there, which means there are more personnel, which means there's more money circulating through the economy.
Now, what about research activities at the university, especially as that relates to maybe high tech and helping to encourage entrepreneurs?
Right. Well, you know, the University of Virginia didn't used to be seen as a sort of research institution, but I think people are realizing that in order to compete globally, we've got to encourage universities to be more research-oriented and to think about ways to commercialize ideas that come out of the university. And so you're seeing around Charlottesville now an uptick in a number of bioscience companies that are growing out of university-sponsored initiatives. Either they're faculty members who are doing certain research, or grants that are being gotten, and it's showing up in the local economy and in the private sector. So you've seen the university become more of a leader in that regard, and I think that's a good thing for the economy and for the Commonwealth.
Now, there are a couple of bills dealing with the universities, especially as that relates to hopefully keeping tuition down, so students can still afford to go to our great institutions of higher learning. I think the majority leader has a bill that would cap fees. Talk to us about that.
Well, there is a bill that's going to, I think, pass on capping of fees for student activities, but it's not going to really affect University of Virginia very much. I mean, it is true that in a lot of smaller schools around the Commonwealth who don't have as much money, you know, if they have a sports organization, it takes a lot of money, and the only way to pay for it, if you don't have ticket revenue, is through student fees. But every time you raise a student fee, the cost to go to college increases. And so we're going to do a little bit about that. But ultimately, unless you invest state money, you're not going to really tackle this tuition problem. Because what's been happening is the amount of state money invested in higher ed, not as an absolute number, has been declining, but as a percentage of their operations has been declining. The result has been that tuition has got to make up the slack, and until we start investing more, we're going to have that problem.
What about this concept of a flat fee for a student who commits to complete his or her education within a 4-year period, and that student may not be interested in all the bells and whistles at a university?
Well, I think that's a great idea. William and Mary now, I think, has some variation of that. I think we've got to look at all kinds of different models. I mean, why do necessarily we have to think about a 4-year degree? Are there 3-year degrees, 2-year degrees? Are there ways that we can use the community college system, which is a lower price alternative, for people to do their first 2 years there and then go to a university? I think you're seeing more of that. I mean, in our area, Piedmont Virginia Community College, which is a great institution, they take a lot of folks in for 2 years, and then under certain circumstances they go right to UVA. That is a great deal for the Commonwealth because the costs are lower for the first 2 years of the community college.
And that's part of the 2+2 program that the state has had for some time. It's good for students who want to obtain a college or university degree. It's also good for students who want to enter a technical field.
Right, exactly. And that's another part of what we're trying to do down here is streamline and make more efficient all of our workforce initiatives. There was a JLARC report done, I think it was last year, and it showed that surprisingly few employers are actually using the workforce initiatives that we've got in the state right now. And yet we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. So this governor has made it one of his priorities to try to streamline that operation. And we're going to see some bills here passed, I hope, that will make it more efficient.
And those community colleges also retrain adults who may have lost employment during the course of the recession.
Absolutely, and that's critically important. You're going to hear a lot about credentialing, making sure that people have the right credentials to get that good job. Sometimes workforce initiatives offer a credential that doesn't fit with what industry needs. And so we're listening a lot to industry in terms of what credentials they need and making sure our community colleges provide that kind of training to get that person that credential that gets them that good job.
And I think about 10% of the population of the Commonwealth consists of veterans. And there are a lot of veterans returning from theaters of war right now, and they need credentialing based upon the experience that they have gathered through their service in the military. That in and of itself may lead them to employment and also to become entrepreneurs.
Absolutely, and again, the governor's been working a lot on this, but this is a bipartisan issue. People on both sides of the aisle believe that we have a duty to the folks who have served us to try to help them when they come back. And there are a number of bills that I think are going to do that.
Some of those bills also that are in the budget would fund 2 new Veterans Service Support Centers, I believe.
Right, in different parts of the state,
Right.
which I think will help veterans a great deal.
Let's talk about the budget a little bit. And I noticed that the Speaker of the House has issued a directive, if you will, that will increase the transparency in the budget process for members of the General Assembly, at least on the House side, and members of the public. Talk to us about that.
That's really interesting because a couple of years ago I had a bill that had a lot of the same provisions in there that he just announced. And sometimes it just takes a while for folks to say, yeah, we need more transparency. We needed time to look at the bill. I mean, it wasn't uncommon several years ago that you'd get a huge budget bill plunked on your desk and be asked to vote on it within an hour. I thought that was crazy. And I think the public thinks it's crazy too. They don't have a chance to look at it either. So we have been working and pushing to get more transparency. Now, under the Speaker's directive, the House is going to have 48 hours to look at this budget bill. Under the Speaker's directive, again, something that a number of us pushed for years, any conference report, which is the budget bill that comes from both the Senate and the House together, has to list anything that was not in either budget initially. In other words, nobody can hide the ball and slip something in the end and have people vote on it and they're not knowing what they're voting on. It has to list any kind of legislation that's in the budget that didn't pass either house. So again, you can't slip things in at the end. That's important for us as legislators so we know what we're voting on, but also for the public who needs to know how their government is operating.
Talk to us about the budget as a whole, especially some of the initiatives of Governor McAuliffe. I know that everyone wants to hold harmless K through 12, and to some extent we've discussed already our institutions of higher learning. But talk to us about the important initiatives in the budget this year.
Well, you know, one of the things that's hung over this budget is the whole issue of sequestration and the money coming into the Commonwealth. We've had to adjust our budget forecast downward, our revenue forecast, with the result that certain things have had to be cut. I've never supported the approach that you just need to cut everything. I've always liked to try to see if we can find some revenue, not by raising taxes, but going after preferences that we've been giving to large companies that maybe are not serving a useful purpose. So I've been trying to reform the coal tax credit. These are two credits that go primarily to benefit the coal industry in Southwest Virginia. They were enacted in 1995, and since the coal credits have been in effect, we have spent almost $600 million. Virginia taxpayers, over $500 million sent to Southwest Virginia, supposedly to encourage production of coal and employment. And what have we got? 25 years ago, there were 11,000 people in the coal mines. There are 3,400 today.
3,400.
3,400 today. There were 48 million tons of coal mined a year. Now it's 17 million tons of coal. So when you look at whether that credit has worked for its intended purpose, it hasn't. So why don't we take a look at it and see if there's some monies we can redirect in different ways to diversify the economy in Southwest Virginia. That's what I've been trying to do. It's not easy. It's a very heavy lift down here.
You also have some legislation in dealing with DNA. Talk to us about that.
Well, this comes out of the Hannah Graham tragedy. Jesse Matthew, the alleged assailant of Hannah Graham, had been convicted many years ago of a trespass. And there was a rape subsequently in Fairfax County, and now he's being linked to that rape. If we had had an expanded DNA database by which we would take samples of people, DNA samples of people, if they were convicted of serious misdemeanor offenses, we might have been able to link Jesse Matthew earlier to this rape in Fairfax, and if that had occurred, he would have never met Hannah Graham that night. So what my bill does is it says that for every serious misdemeanor offense, we're not talking about jaywalking, traffic offenses, violations of Freedom of Information Act, not those things. We're talking about assault, larceny, burglar, anything that's a serious misdemeanor. Have people who are convicted have a swab taken just inside their cheek, you put it in a database, much like you take their fingerprint and you put that in a database. It's just DNA is better in terms of being able to catch the bad guys and let the good guys be exonerated because their DNA doesn't match.
And I think that's an important distinction in terms of a person who's been convicted versus someone who is arrested and charged with something.
Absolutely. We don't want to take, some people want to take DNA of everybody who's ever been born. That is not what this bill is about. I couldn't support that. But if you're convicted, that makes sense because we take your fingerprints now.
No question
But
about it.
DNA is a better identifier. And if we can catch bad guys in the process and keep good guys out of jail, exonerate the people who are not doing things, that's a good thing.
Back to K through 12 funding, as I understand it, the hold harmless means K through 12 will be at the level they were in 2009.
Well, that's right, and that's got a lot of us concerned. That's why I don't like a cuts-only budget. Then you freeze K through 12. I think we need to find money to pay teachers higher salaries. I think there's a chance we may be able to do that. It's not clear yet, but the economy is picking up a little bit in Virginia, and if we reform our revenue estimates and we look at some of these credits, we may be able to find some money to do that.
Now, last year, the General Assembly cut back the number and frequency of the standards of learning tests that are administered at the lower grade levels. I think that there's some more work yet to be done in relation to the high school levels. What's going on with standards of learning?
Well, we got this commission, and we've got some new bills this year. And one of the bills I think is really interesting, and this has been supported by Albemarle in the past, and that is, rather than having every year schools have to be certified, if you can show a consistent pattern of high performance, why not waive the certification? Do it every 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And I think the bill that's working its way through has some of these concepts in it. It will give Albemarle and Charlottesville much more flexibility in dealing with these required certifications. We're going to be looking at the tests. We're going to continue to eliminate some tests because I think people down here, both sides of the aisle, believe that the high-stake testing approach, while it does bring some accountability, and we'll have to do some of it, is not the solution to our problem.
Now, what about the other piece of legislation that passed last year that would have required schools to be graded on an A to F scale?
I think people have lost enthusiasm for that idea. It's too difficult to figure out how to define what A is and what F is. And so I don't think we're going to be using that scale much. I mean, intuitively it makes sense, right? You know, it's the way we used to do it. But there's so many things that go on in the school division, and there's so many nuances that I think people have kind of abandoned that concept.
And of course, last year there was legislation that created a state authority with the ability to take over failing schools. I think that legislation failed to meet constitutional muster, so to speak, and was declared unconstitutional.
Well, yeah, there are serious problems with that legislation, and we have to figure out ways to intervene to help failing schools, but having the private sector or some kind of entity in Richmond control them rather than locality doesn't make a lot of sense.
Now, transportation is still a huge issue statewide, and I'm sure in your district as well. We've got funding from a very large funding package that was created a couple of years ago now. It's being implemented. How are things going along in terms of the implementation of that legislation?
Well, as with every piece of legislation, gets tweaked over time. And this year, we're working with what's called the formula for distribution of money, especially to more rural areas. You don't think of Charlottesville as rural, but it is in a rural district, the Culpeper Transportation District. And there's been very little money for local roads, if any money, over the last 5, 6.
Those are the secondary roads?
Secondary roads. This new bill will infuse some more money into the Culpeper District so we can do some more work on secondary roads, potentially on unpaved roads, that we weren't able to do before. That'll be good for Albemarle County, and that bill probably is going to get passed this session.
Our training centers, one of them has closed, and if my memory serves me correctly, there was a Department of Justice settlement with the Commonwealth of Virginia a few years ago that gave the state the discretion of how to deal with individuals who are institutionalized in those training centers. There's been a lot of pushback from parents of those who are institutionalized. What's going on with that?
Well, you know, there's pushback from me because I understand and I accept the idea that we should try to have people in the community as much as we can. We don't need to be institutionalizing people who have disabilities that are now not so inhibiting they can't live in the community. And I think that's what the federal lawsuit was about. It says that under federal law, you just can't keep people in institutions. You got to locate them in the community. But you know, at the same time, there are a lot of people who cannot live in the community, and you got to have these so-called training centers to have a place for them where they can be safe. And that's why so many parents get upset, because they know that their child can't live on can't live in a community setting, and it's going to require a lot of attention. But we've had too many people institutionalized, and we're moving them out of the centers.
Now, when we talk about their children, we're talking about adult children now of elderly parents, are we not?
That's a great point. You know, people who are now getting their 60s, 70s, and they have kids 20 years younger, and when these people die, there's nobody to watch out for these people. And so that's why you got to be very careful to protect those who really are in need.
Now, there's been a need this session to balance new entrants versus incumbents, especially when new technologies arise. Uber, Lyft now provides an opportunity for people with smartphones through an app to get service at their door, so to speak, and take you from point A to point B. That's been debated. I believe there's been an agreement in terms of legislation now to regulate everybody fairly. Talk to us about the pros and cons of that whole debate.
Oh, wow. That's another 30 minutes. But we've dealt with that bill in the Transportation Committee. I serve on that committee. A lot of people were worried about Uber coming in and basically cherry picking the good fares and leaving people in neighborhoods that might not be as desirable without the opportunity to have this service. People have been worried about the insurance for folks who get into an urban Uber car. And taxi cab drivers have been concerned that Uber might not do the background checks of their drivers and may put some of the public at risk. So there have been a lot of concerns. They've generally been ironed out. And so Uber is here to stay. I mean, it is a classic disruptive technology,
Right.
but it does create competition, which is a good thing. And there are still some insurance issues about what happens if you get into an Uber car that is, they call off the app. In other words, they're not picking you up pursuant to your call on the app, but they picked you up either at a street hail or they just made arrangements to pick you up, and whether you're actually insured in that vehicle. But we're trying to iron out some of those things, and if we can't do it this year, I think we'll do it next year.
So you're balancing the entrance of the incumbents, the new entrant, and especially consumers to make sure they are protected.
They've got to be safe. That's the paramount thing in our minds, that they have to be safe.
So I see you have a green ribbon on today. What's the occasion?
Well, today's Energy Awareness Day at the Capitol, and there are going to be a lot of bills up to talk about energy, solar energy, renewables. I've got a couple of bills I've got a bill that's interesting that will allow electric cars to feed the stored energy in their batteries while they're sitting back to the grid.
Oh, wow.
It's a very cool concept. It doesn't generate much energy, but allows a more efficient use of the energy that has been taken from the grid and put into the battery while the car runs, so that it doesn't just dissipate, it goes somewhere. And that will help modulate the frequency of the grid and I think make it more efficient. It's a very new concept, so we'll see if Virginia's ready for it.
Great. Well, thank you for being here, Delegate David Toscano.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.